Hi, I'm Natalie, and today I'm going to talk briefly about sustainable tourism initiatives in Ireland and marketing tourism. I did formerly work in Irish tourism, but was usually more interested in pure history, and I've recently taken an interest in the operations and overall impacts of this huge industry. So I'm grateful to the organizers of the conference for allowing me to share some thoughts. The photos that I'm using in this presentation, they don't belong to me. The black and white photos are all from the Bord Fáilte archives, while the color photos are from modern ads. So tourist destinations rely heavily on marketing to remain competitive, and Ireland is no exception to that rule, often advertising its scenery and culture as a lush and welcoming escape from modern life. Investment in tourism is expected to have a profitable return through higher tourist numbers. In the case of Ireland and other countries, tourism also has positive, noticeable impacts on foreign relations, foreign direct investment, and domestic development. In recent decades, tourism sustainability has become a prime focus for government and heritage groups. The OECD notes over-tourism is a threat to the environment, built heritage, culture, and community of any given area. There have been hundreds of initiatives across the world over the last 50 years which attempt to employ and study sustainable tourism. But as sustainable tourism principles consider the economic, sociocultural, and environmental sustainability of any operation, these interests can often end up competing against one another. So how does this play out in Ireland? When we consider this question, it's important to note that a great deal of preservation efforts of Irish heritage, both built and natural, were not conservation driven, but more often driven by identity and driven by the public and not the government. In fact, it has been the case numerous times that citizen groups have resisted government efforts that seek to expand tourism at the cost of sustainability. I argue that it's important to remember this because it also is directly related to the way that Irish scenery and rural life is marketed. In this way, the nostalgic marketing of Irish scenery helps sustain one of the more powerful forces in Irish sustainability movements, which is the cultural and historical legacy of the land. I want to quickly outline the scope of Irish tourism. Before the pandemic, tourism was estimated to employ 260,000 people across the island of Ireland. Unfortunately, upwards of 180,000 of them have been lost or are vulnerable. The Irish government is, of course, executing plans to try to kickstart recovery when it's possible. But before COVID, Ireland already had multiple plans for new tourism investment. One of them was through Fáilte Ireland. It was a 4-year capital investment plan of 150 million euros. That is on top of the annual budget, which, for instance, in 2019 was 168.7 million euro. It's a lot of money, but on the other side, in 2018, the total expenditure to the Irish GDP was 9.4 billion euro, or 3% of the Irish GDP. Given that it is such a small percentage of the GDP relative to the other countries that I have listed, is revenue the only reason that Ireland devotes so much to tourism? Of course not. The other part tourism plays is in building Ireland's image on the international stage. Ireland and Irish people are very well known for the small size of the country and population. The Republic of Ireland has really only had 100 years to take its place in international politics, and without delving too far into that, because that's the area that I currently work in here in Washington, D.C., this is a difficult task for a small nation, but it has led to a really striking amount of respect across the world for Ireland and its politicians, exemplified most recently in the election of Ireland to the National Security Council of the UN. In 2015, Micheál Martin said in an interview that tourism isn't 100 miles away from foreign relations. Where people go and engage in terms of visiting tends to act as a momentum builder or catalyst for better relations, end quote. The Global Greening Initiative, a partnership between the Department of Foreign Affairs and Tourism Ireland, is one such program I would say is a pretty good example of this. Niall Gibbons, the CEO of Tourism Ireland, noted a few weeks ago, our St. Patrick's Day program around the world is more important than ever before. During this challenging time, we want to mark St. Patrick's Day and to keep Ireland to the fore in a positive light on the day when people everywhere are thinking about Ireland. It's difficult to imagine any other English-speaking country having even a comparable influence, so that the very idea of the nation brings up feelings of positivity around the world. But this demonstrates a really heightened awareness of Ireland and a substantial degree of soft power. And this is not lost, of course, on the Irish government and the bodies in charge of tourism, who all recognize that these things lead to more foreign direct investment in Ireland and better influence on the international political stage. So if marketing Ireland is our goal, what exactly is being marketed? In advertisements, Ireland markets a few things consistently and in varying ways over the last century. Its people, its built heritage, and its land. For the rest of this time, I'm really only going to talk about the marketing sustainability of the land. The idea of land and land ownership in Ireland is deeply rooted in history and does impact its influence on tourists and the way that it's marketed. It's not the beauty of Ireland's scenery alone that gives it such significance. It's sometimes criticized, but Ireland's scenery is marketed as a sort of nostalgic, timeless place, what anthropologist Paul Collinson has referred to as rural paradise, which is like a comical, interesting terminology considering the history of rural Ireland. It's been under threat for, of course, decades and centuries by multiple things, but more recently, international agricultural development and increasingly centralized government and modernization. In fact, the emptiness of Ireland can often spur allusions to the greatest tragedy of Ireland's history, the Great Hunger, which of course led to mass death, emigration, and rural decline. However, the idea that it's a paradise is not incompatible with that. It's just intertwined in a really interesting way. The nostalgic admiration of Irish scenery is related to the other topics I have mentioned already, those being Ireland's fierce presence in international relations and the supposed familiarity the world has with Irish people. These three topics, as many aspects of Irish studies, can be traced back to the diaspora as one influence. The reverence that is held for Ireland or rural Ireland by many North Americans, British people, and Australians is real and is not necessarily incompatible with the beliefs of the Irish people currently living there. It's just different. It has developed differently. Historian Thomas Bremer writes that, and I quote, "Locative claims tend to regard place as timeless. The perception of permanence implies that a particular site escaped the forces of historical change. Place gains its meaningfulness and retains importance in narratives," end quote. So in this way, visiting Ireland is almost a pilgrimage for a lot of people. And so that would make them more of a pilgrim tourist. It's difficult to imagine how to advertise for a market that is so personal, but what a pilgrim tourist consumes on a visit is an idea of a place that has already begun. It's something that they brought with them. In other words, generational memories of rural Ireland are often difficult, but in diaspora narratives, the grievance is not directed at the land. It's directed at the policies and events which led to decline and emigration. Thus, the idea of rural Ireland as a homeland and untouched by current circumstances or events and is understandable, and also the fact that it's kind of empty of any more realistic or mundane elements of rural Irish life. And this is what kind of gives this global idea of an idyllic life on a farm. From the local perspective, however, and despite good intentions of tourists or pilgrim tourists, rural tourism can often be unsustainable. Although it has long been seen as a means for rural development, studies have shown that it does not help the income of farmers, who are, of course, key stakeholders in most rural areas. It does, however, diversify the rural economy, which is really important and a good sustainer of rural Ireland by preventing population decline, maintaining the economy, and hopefully empowering local government. The recently published Tourism Recovery Plan noted that in many rural areas, tourism is the only employer outside of agriculture and often employs a higher percentage of younger people. In fact, in County Kerry, tourism accounts for 18% of jobs. In Donegal, that number is 13%, and in Waterford, that number is 12%, all higher than the national average of just under 10% of jobs being in the tourism industry. But keeping rural Irish tourism sustainable economically, environmentally, and culturally all comes down to stakeholder engagement. Rural tourist destinations already face challenges that successful tourism destinations do not, which makes it difficult to connect with a wider tourism network in an equitable manner. In empirical studies by the World Tourism Organization, roughly half of all collaborative rural tourism relationships have ended in failure. Even small tourism enterprises can generate an unmanageable amount of traffic, consume a lot of natural resources, and generate a great deal of waste. The nature of rural areas is that they are not equipped for large numbers of people. For instance, the Interpretive Center at the Cliffs of Moher was built to accommodate 400,000 visitors per year, yet in 2018, visitor numbers approached 1.6 million. Measures were then taken to reduce the congestion and the management issues, such as having coach tours depart from a higher number of local towns to decrease the dwelling time in the immediate area. This is a good solution because it spreads out the benefits of tourism from the Cliffs of Moher. However, in expanding the realm of the Cliffs of Moher, the towns now serving as launch points will necessarily be changed too. So for this reason, even if it might seem minor, it's really crucial to first have the buy-in of all the stakeholders who might be affected in rural tourism collaboration. The centralization of Irish tourism presents a problem, though, for collaboration with rural Ireland. There are two tourism agencies in Ireland right now, Fáilte Ireland and Tourism Ireland, compared with 9 in 2005. One or two agencies overseeing policy and budget necessarily means less collaboration. Moreover, some would argue that participation on any level is not enough if the participants are not entirely informed. That is, the success of collaboration relies on everyone retaining the same knowledge of the situation and impacts. This, of course, would lead to full awareness of any detrimental effects in any collaborative scheme. Unfair collaboration, or indeed no collaboration, is unfortunately a hallmark of tourism anywhere, and certainly in Ireland. This has led to multiple conservation movements in Ireland led by citizens, and some were successful in stopping tourism operations that were seen to be purely financially driven and damaging to the community, thus unsustainable. The interesting thing is, though, that these conservation efforts, much like many of the tourists who flock to rural Ireland, are identity driven, not environmental or green. Rural Ireland retains a degree of localism that some, like economist Patrick Cummins, have referred to as rural fundamentalism, which perhaps is a little bit too loaded of terminology, but it reflects what many historians, economists, and sociologists have observed about rural Irish society. There is a partiality to ideas of conventional self-sufficiency, local wisdom about the natural environment, and emphasis on localized power of landowners. Family-based farms are all really important. And there is this resistance to foreign influence. Now, foreign influence in this sense can absolutely mean regional or national power. So the concept of self-reliance is also important to note because it means that traditions of community support really have thrived in rural Ireland, and that gives more momentum behind these citizen-led movements. And this has grown out of centuries of what was, in the best of times, neglect for rural Irish citizens, often much worse, coupled with centuries of draining rural Ireland's natural resources. So similar to the nostalgia members of the global Irish diaspora have, generational memories in rural Ireland have affected specific regard for the land and the way of life that is related to that. In terms of tourism development, in certain instances, when a scheme or program has been seen to threaten that culture or shift the balance of power of the land, there have been instances of successful pushback. One example is the Burren Action Group, which led the Clare County Council to refuse a planning permission proposed by the state to build an interpretive center in Mullimore. Other local groups did support the plan because of the potential economic benefits, but ultimately courts sided with the Burren Action Group. Some advocated lightly against the plans because of the potential environmental impact, but the sentiments more often expressed had more to do with the aesthetic beauty and the lack of access to the planned interpretive center by the local residents. The appeals board even stated in their decision that, and I quote, "Development would lead to an unacceptable degradation of the physical environment in this area of outstanding landscape beauty. The proposal was not suited to the natural character of an undeveloped part of the Burren and would seriously detract from the scenic, amenity, and rural character of the landscape," end quote. What other studies have found in examining Irish attitudes towards the environment are not out of line with this. Paul Collinson reviewed the sentiments of members of various tidy towns boards across Ireland and concluded that most considerations were based on aesthetics, not a flourishing environment. A more contentious example of this, and less successful, unfortunately, was the resistance to the M3 motorway construction through the area around the Hill of Tara. Despite protests from locals, heritage groups, and archaeologists, the motorway was approved and completed. Protest groups were not opposed because of environmental reasons at all. They recognized the need for a new road. The resistance was purely about the area, and it was intensely sentimental. This instance stands as an example of the disregard the Irish government has exercised in the past for truly sustainable development regarding or near tourist sites. The Hill of Tara is a tourism site, but it's also extremely historically significant and in many ways thought of as sacred and spiritual. Even the archaeologists who were employed to examine and ultimately approve the plans were not third parties. They were directly commissioned by the road authorities. So this all points to severely imbalanced gathering of stakeholders in the development process. To conclude, tourism sustainability in Ireland faces significant challenges in the decades ahead that might lead to some unfair compromises. Rural tourism needs programs that will protect the unspoiled environment for the foreign tourist who expects to consume it, such as my brother, who is photographed there in the picture on Dunangus. So it needs to be there for the tourists, but it also, more importantly, needs to benefit the desires and the livelihoods of the people who live in rural Ireland. While foreign tourism does give some impetus to the government to protect rural Ireland, history has shown that agrarian attitudes wield immense power and often have a different opinion. So the engagement and empowerment of Irish people, who are the ultimate hosts and custodians of this scenery that is so admired around the world, it's vital to have their buy-in, and they are vital to the success of its preservation and its appeal. Thank you.